You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Eric Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Eric.
Welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. This is Josh Mead, and I am joined today with Alex, and he is a missionary with ABWE, but maybe there's a different title you have. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm Alex Kocman. I am not a missionary. I serve as Director of Communications and Engagement with ABWE. So I have the high privilege and honor of doing what you do, in part, which is celebrating and serving other missionaries by telling their story and hoping to hold the rope well for them. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're so glad to have you, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. I've been watching over the past couple of weeks some of your interviews that you can find on YouTube, and you have a podcast as well yourself, right? What's the name of that podcast?
Yeah, that's right. ABWE's got a couple different podcasts that we put out, and of course, we're a global family of ministries spanning some 90 countries with about 1,000 workers. But specifically, the Missions podcast is what I've been able to invest a lot of time into. My co-hosts, Scott Dunford, and I both host that. And we've got over 400 episodes. We've been going about 8 years with that show. Really the goal there, as we say each week in the introduction, is to help goers think and thinkers go, because we see that there's this gulf between the way that we think about theology and the way that we treat scripture. And yet there's this pragmatic side of work that's done both in stateside ministry and on the mission field, where for some reason we're not always letting our theology inform our practice. And also we recognize there's this ivory tower tendency that we have that needs to be challenged also by those who've gone out. And so we try to bring those two worlds together and tell stories of what God's doing around the world every Sunday night at 7 p.m.
I love it. Yes. And I highly recommend our audience go check that out and give that a listen. We're going to get into some conversations about theological aspects and how that should drive ministry. And I think there is sometimes a disconnect with implementing our strategy, and it disconnects with our theology sometimes. And my biggest thing was, especially when I came to the mission field, is when you arrive, it's one thing to theorize about implementing ministry and doing the work of the Lord on the mission field. And then when you actually get there, it's sometimes you don't even know where to begin. What do I do? And so I want to really get down to some of the grassroots of missions and ministry. We might talk about some basics, but I think after this conversation, we're definitely going to want to have you back on to get a little deeper into it. But I wanted to start, maybe get some background. Tell us a little bit about yourself personally, your upbringing, what led you into ministry, specifically leading up to the current position you have right now.
Sure. And I've often thought that I'm the worst person to be in my position, which just might mean that God's trying to get as much glory as possible out of me, so that I can't take any of the credit at all. I grew up like a lot of church kids grew up in Philadelphia, solid believing family, Christian school background. But the way a lot of evangelical young people grow up is, there's a couple prayers you're not supposed to pray. There's a couple things that you're always worried, well, what if God calls me in this direction or that direction? And for me, the thought was always, well, I certainly don't want God to call me to singleness, and I don't want God to call me to Africa or something like that. The idea of missions just seemed too foreign. I'm a person that loves his creature comforts. I'm a creature of habit. My co-host Scott will tell you, I'm up at the exact same time every day. I like predictability. I like order. And so the idea of something that doesn't fit into that box, that never appealed to me. Of course, I walked with the Lord, but really fell into some sin and rebellion. And in my teen years, the Lord pulled me back and drew me to himself. And I was baptized and really became a part of the local church more intentionally. And pretty early on in high school, started to have ministry aspirations. Went to Liberty University and studied biblical studies with that in mind, and met my wife there, as one does at a Christian college or university. But while in college, you're looking around in a biblical studies program or in a pastoral leadership program, especially a school that's in the South. I was surrounded by a lot of good old Baptist preacher boys who they knew that they were called, at least the way they would describe it. They had sensed a call to pastoral ministry or to the mission field from a very young age 5. They were born on the altar, right? That type of a story. And they walked the aisle and responded to some call to give your life to the Lord at that age, with an eye towards vocational ministry. Well, I never had that. I had a mixture of passions. I had done a little bit of graphic design. I'd done a little bit of writing. I was really interested in theology and apologetics. I had studied journalism briefly. And so what was I going to do with all of that? I wasn't exactly sure. And then a little book by the name of Radical found its way into my hands. And it convicted me, but it didn't lead me anywhere to go. I recognized that I needed to put my yes on the table with the Lord, be willing to follow him wherever he leaded, even if it was something that I personally wouldn't have signed up to do. And but at the same time, through a season of prayer, my young wife and I, we started to think about where would the Lord have us to go. And maybe it wasn't just to stay in a kind of an insular Christian environment like Lynchburg, Virginia. Maybe it was to go somewhere where we could potentially be more on the front lines of ministry. And so we were looking at a variety of different jobs and praying through different options, and ultimately recognized that the Lord was working in us to give us the heart of senders, and to throw ourselves into ministry in the local church, to pour out in that way, and for the overflow of that ministry to be the sending of missionaries. Because we had a heart for the nations. We had understood that at that point, but it hadn't connected specifically with a inclination towards a particular field or people group or faraway place. It was a recognition that a healthy church is going to send people out, and how can we make sure that that happens? And so having, sort of put my yes on the table with God, as some people like to say, kind of writing in the blank check, I'm looking at all of these different options. And I, again, had these two things stuck in my mind. Well, willing to do a lot of different things, but don't send me back to Pennsylvania, and don't want to be in youth ministry. And like clockwork, I ended up in youth ministry in Pennsylvania. And the Lord used not only that ministry opportunity to bring us back here, closer to family, but also used a job opportunity that my wife found at an organization I had not heard of called ABWE. And we started to get to know some of the leaders here, started to connect with like-minded people who had a heart for the nations, and who were also some of the most ordinary people. And missionaries don't levitate, right? They're ordinary people. But I had this image of someone on the field on a pedestal, right? This person that was holier than everyone else around them, and interacting with other missionaries who were in a lot of different ways, a lot like myself, raising young children, many of them older, but individuals who were gloriously ordinary. And so that started to shatter some of my paradigms. And within a few years, the Lord opened a door to serve there in a mobilizing capacity, working with local churches, working with long-term missionary candidates, and helping them to discern their call, helping them to check themselves up against not only the qualifications to serve with ABWE, but the biblical qualifications for ministry too. And out of that has come a ministry at ABWE for about the last 8 or 9 years here soon. And we're privileged to be a part of it. And we still call Pennsylvania home, us and our 4 children.
Well, that's exciting. That's a common journey. We hear how most young men going into ministry, you hit the nail on the head. There are some guys you'll meet that seem to have their whole life mapped out from the time they were young.
Right.
I was kind of like that. I knew God wanted me to be a missionary when I was 13 years old. I always wanted to go to Africa. I knew I was coming here to serve in Senegal when I was a freshman. So the Lord just kind of made it abundantly clear what he had for me. But most guys, I would say the majority of young men going into ministry, going into Bible college, just don't have any clue about what long-term God would have for me. And I think that the Lord does that because he wants you to take those steps by faith, trusting him one step at a time. But can that be a little intimidating do you think sometimes if you go into Bible college and you got maybe a little interest in missions, but everybody around you maybe seems to have it all together, right? They know where they're going, what they're doing. do you think sometimes maybe a young man might hesitate and think, well, maybe missions isn't for me? And why should he still consider missions when maybe that hasn't been a lifelong desire he's had?
Hmm. Yeah, I was intimidated by those that had that clear articulation of calling. And it took several years to realize that that wasn't the only way to experience a calling. And also to realize that that's not even always the best way. In some ways, it's necessary to have that strong internal call, that feeling that, well, I must give myself to the work. And certainly that's something that can sustain someone serving on the field throughout suffering, throughout long periods of apparent fruitless toil. But what matters as much as anything else is the objective calling and the affirmation of others, and specifically the role of the local church in recognizing that too. So I needed to reframe my perspective. I remember one conversation with a friend of mine who serves in the office, and he is our executive director overseeing ministries in the Middle East. One of the things that had first brought us together was we were in a prayer group praying for the Muslim world together. We had visited a local mosque several times and had built some relationships. We're trying to take some of these local Muslim individuals in our community, some of the men to lunch, and having really quality spiritual conversations with them. And so that had been a big feature in my relationship with this gentleman, in our friendship. And he said, Alex, I'd love to recruit you for our Middle East team. And you're waiting for the rest of that sentence, right? Dot, dot, dot. He says, but you're perfect in your current role, and so grateful for how the Lord's using you. And for me, that was confirmation. Sometimes the internal call hits you like a lightning bolt, and you have to pursue a certain direction. Sometimes you just wake up in it. And for me, it felt a lot more like waking up in it and realizing that this disconnected constellation of gifts and desires and passions and talents and opportunities that I had, from writing to media and ministry and a heart for the nations, all of those things, could actually be used fully in a role like I'm in now, where we're telling stories of missionaries. We're developing content to bring God's heart for the nations in front of churches, and also to encourage missionaries themselves too. So that was something encouraging for me. But again, I do feel like there's a lot of young men who, like I was, are walking around with this spirit of guilt. They know they need to care about missions. They don't feel a personal, compelling desire to go, but they don't feel like they're doing enough for the Lord. And really, my passion is to see that unlocked, and really just to see each of us commit to doing something, whether it's going, sending, or some other capacity in the mission, doing something, and also glorifying God in other vocations as well.
Absolutely. That's one of the topics I want to get to, and maybe we'll get to it later, is how really the pastor today in the U.S. in most regions really has to become missionary. And I think because there's such a demographic shift, there are cultural shifts that have taken place over the past couple of decades. I've noticed as I travel the States on our furloughs, on our home assignments, there has been a significant shift. And I'll say this, and maybe we'll discuss it in a minute, but I noticed when I first began raising support and people were looking at the country we're going to, it's predominantly Islamic. This is, a few years after 2001 and all of the incidents of 9/11, all that. And there was like a sense of, why are you going to this country? Why would you specifically reach this demographic? And I've seen a significant shift from concern about, oh, is it safe? Should you really go? Like, are they really going to respond to this last furlough? Especially a lot of not just pastors, but everyday people in church asking, how can I reach my Muslim coworker? How can I reach, my neighbor? How do I have a conversation? And so I think there's a big demographic shift, not just in major urban areas, but even in rural areas, that you really have to become more missionary. And so I love what God has called you to do, because I think there needs to be, on the part of the sending church, of the churches that are supporting missionaries, a more robust understanding of mission, of what missions is for the church and how the church is to be engaged in missions. And yes, through giving is a significant way. But like you said, I think there's a lot of different aspects and avenues by which we can engage the unreached regions of the world. And so that my next question was going to be, what are you passionate about? I think you've already shared a lot of that, but it's, you're now serving with something you love doing, which is helping to cultivate a heart for missions among churches in the States. What does that look like? Like, what is your routine on a regular basis? How are you engaging churches? This is your passion. Now, what does that look like?
Yeah, the routine does vary widely as far as the work I'm giving myself to. I did say I'm a creature of habit earlier, so the wake up time is still the same, but the work is widely different. And any given day, we might be recording episodes of the Missions podcast or one of our other shows designed to get particularly pastors thinking not just about missions, like here's this topic over here that you need to think it's required for you to think about this every now and again, which I think is the mentality that a lot of them have, but rather to bring that into the warp and woof of your normal pastoral ministry, that whether you're a pastor, if you're a lay elder, if you're a missionary, if you're even a lay person, but all of these roles, we're all ambassadors. We're all called to be striving together for the faith, Philippians 1:27. And that means that how do I advance the gospel in my sphere? How do I promote the kingdom? That needs to be at the forefront of my concerns each day, right? So sometimes it's producing a podcast. We produce a magazine as well. I travel and do preaching frequently on behalf of ABWE as well, and also serve in my church on our elder team and lead worship. And so there's a lot of variety to that. But to me, the tip of the spear is, how do we take all of the action and activity and sometimes frenetic activity of the Christian life, and how can we make that oriented towards gospel advance using that Philippians 1:27 paradigm? That's been a really helpful concept for me lately. A lot of it is also the functions that a mission agency performs. In the military, you think about the tooth to tail ratio, and for every one person on the front lines of combat, you have, depending on the branch or the time in history, anywhere between 4 and 10 support workers on the supply lines. And for us at ABWE, as for your agency and other agencies that have been represented on the show, it's much the same. It takes a lot of logistics for ABWE and all of us in order to be able to sustain workers on the field too. And some of those concerns from a policy level, from a care level, all of that occupies our time as well. So there's no dull moments, but it can be hard to predict what's going to come each day.
So you wrote a book. Did you co-author it, or you were the primary author of the book, book by the mission by the book?
Missions by the Book. I co-wrote that a few years ago with Chad Vegas. Chad is the one of the co-founders of Radius International. Many people would be familiar with Radius. He's very involved in Missionary and the Missionary conference that just happened not too long ago in Jacksonville. And he pastors in Bakersfield, California. And he and I both wrote that because we were coming from different roles, but similar in some ways, both involved in pastoral ministry, both involved in agencies or parachurch organizations focused on missions, and realizing that just like in the seeker-driven, attractional megachurch world, where there's these pragmatic methodologies that are employed to draw in as many unbelievers as possible, and really, as long as your front door is a little bit bigger than your back door, you can get your return on investment into the positive. And I think we've all seen churches that function as big crowd gathering businesses in that way. But we saw some of the same thinking with the best of evangelistic intentions, but we saw some of the same thinking in the missions community, where there is that latent strain of pragmatism where, oh, I'm not a theologian, but I'm the doer. I'm the person doing the work, putting my hand to the plow, and we're going to try this, and we're going to maybe fudge on the definition of what is a real local church that's been planted. And rather than preaching the gospel, we're going to plant certain ideas, but are we really proclaiming the whole counsel of God's word, we started to see some signs of compromise coming into the missions community. Many of those compromises already there and thriving. And so we wrote Missions by the Book, How Theology and Practice Walk Together. That's a phrase or an idea taken from Petrus von Maastricht. But that idea being that doctrine and life, or in this case, doctrine and the work that you do for the gospel's advance, those should not be disconnected concerns. It ought not to be the case that a young missionary recruit leaves seminary or leaves Bible college and is told on their first term, okay, take all of your systematic theology, everything that was taught you, and check that at the door. And now you're really going to learn that all of that is negotiable in this new cultural context. Yes, paradigms are challenged. Yes, we have to contextualize, but we shouldn't draw this massive line, this kind of great gulf that's fixed oftentimes between what we believe and then actually how we go about supporting missions. And so our goal was twofold. One was we wanted to get missionary practitioners thinking about the doctrines they were taught and how do those doctrines rightly understood apply to what they're doing. And usually not in a pragmatic way is the answer to that. But then we also wanted to get pastors, missions committee leaders or members, anyone involved on the sending side, the holding the rope side. We wanted them to recognize that we can't wrestle with all of the doctrines that we do. We walked through a lot of the doctrines you deal with in systematic theology. So we have a chapter on our theology proper. We have our chapter on our Christology, our pneumatology, our ecclesiology. You can't wrestle with those important truths and really come face to face with what Scripture says about them and not see there that there's something for the nations and there's something that needs to be done in getting this truth out to others. And so we wanted to make those two worlds conversant with each other again. We wanted to give lay leaders in the church tools to be able to discern what's happening in missions. Is it good, bad, or indifferent? So Chad Vegas and I put that out. That's with Founders Press. You can find that from Founders Ministries. And then available on pre-order right now is Striving for the Faith, also with Founders, that focuses on that Philippians 1:27 idea. And we'll be filling orders for that in February.
Excellent. I'm intrigued by just the concept of the how essential, how our theology has to drive our strategy. And then not only that, but when we actually implement it on the field, I think you hit the nail on the head. A lot of missionaries that are going to the field are not pragmatic by nature. You know, we're pretty black and white but we're flexible as well. But I think there is this tendency when you get to the field, having been here for 15 years and not only analyzing my own ministry constantly, why we're doing what we're doing, but observing others who have come, some who have come and gone, other ministries that have endured. And I try to look at ministries and ask, okay, why did that not last? Why didn't that stick? And this church plant, what went wrong there? And I wonder sometimes, because I never thought of this until I was watching one of your podcasts. I haven't read your book yet. I'm looking forward to reading it. But I was watching an interview you were doing, and you were making that connection between kind of how the seeker-sensitive movement has really just collapsed. And it really was not helpful in establishing churches in the U.S. And I think missionaries, it's easy to shift into, especially when you're cross-cultural, you get to the field and you got to gauge success somehow, right? How do I know I'm being effective? And you have to gauge it based on usually the response of those you're trying to communicate the gospel to. And then added on top of that, there's the accountability and the reporting you have to give back to your supporting churches. And a missionary tends to put more of the pressure on himself, maybe than the supporting churches do. But a year goes by, and maybe you're in a tough place where people are responding as much. It's easy, I think, to shift into that mentality. Okay, what can I implement to just get people to respond? You know, it's almost, I don't think missionaries intentionally go into it thinking I'm going to be seeker sensitive and trying to find out how I can contextualize the actual gospel in a way that people will just say that they're Christian now, because it is a challenging it's a challenging thing to balance that. And I'm sure as you studied and interacted with missionaries, especially in countries where there's no Christian background. I mean, my context is Islam. Senegal is an Islamic nation. The only other Christian church that people know of is the Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church. Their own cardinal said the other last couple months ago, we don't do evangelism. Why? We need to actually maybe start reaching people for the gospel. So they don't do evangelism. Here they don't, and they have. With that being said, in the context of the people group I'm working with, specifically Wolof and the Fulani, our pastor, our lead pastor now, he is a Wolof believer. He's second generation. His dad is the first Wolof Christian that anybody knows of in this region for hundreds of miles. And he was saved in 1993, I think it was. So that's how young the Christian movement is in this among the Wolof people. And so I think that if you don't know how to gauge success and you don't know how to gauge whether or not what you're doing is accomplishing anything, then you can drift, like you said, into maybe a more become pragmatic and implement ministries that will maybe give you a semblance of success, but you're not actually doing anything. And so let me give one example, and then I want to get some feedback from you. There was a mission here, and I forget which one it was, and it's unimportant, but our pastor, Malik, he was sharing with me that they came in, they brought about 30 guys from churches in the capital, and they planted them in strategic areas. And basically, once they had 2 or 3 people coming to a Bible study, they declared it was a church. And they invested some and did some work. And then after a year, they all kind of, the initial guys who started the works went back to their homes and nothing remained. There's nothing there now. But they declared they had all these churches started. And just because they had brought in people from another region, planted them in an area, did Bible studies for a while, had some initial, and then left. So let me get back to, I think it comes back to our theology. What is the definition of a missionary? What is your job? Like, what are you sent to do? Are you sent to plant churches? Is that if you don't plant a church, are you not successful? What is the missionary theologically, biblically? And then how do we practically incorporate our theology into the implementation of ministry on the field? Let's start with what is a missionary?
Yeah, and if I could just react briefly first to some of the other things you shared. I've seen that story before as well, about generous statistical counting of churches. That's of concern. I've heard from people with leading agencies that they serve with on the field that are still being trained, or at least some within these networks are still presenting things like insider movements positively, even though I think most of the mission community, I would say, has probably repudiated that. There's still an undercurrent promoting things like insider movements, having Muslims secretly identifying, or rather having supposed converted Christians identifying as socioculturally Muslim. Say that 5 times fast. And then you have all of these other diluted versions of that as well. It comes in under this guise not only of pragmatism, but you don't want to impose, you don't want to, engage in kind of the colonizing, right, my way or the highway thing. And so the way that a missionary is trained to enter in now, and there's much good in this, is to come alongside of nationals and to catalyze a movement, which there can be some good in that. We should come in a humble posture, and we pray the Lord would bring a movement. But when those sensibilities become the governing paradigm at the expense of the missionary task itself, is where we get into trouble, which leads to your question, what is that essential missionary task? What is a missionary? And I would say that a missionary is simply a gospel ambassador commissioned by the local church for the work of ministry. And that's broad, but I think biblically, you see the Apostle Paul, he's traveling far and wide. He's not necessarily doing cross-cultural work the way we think of it today. So I don't think you can necessarily tie up language learning and cultural acquisition in the definition of a missionary, even though I think functionally we tend to roll that into the definition of a missionary. But fundamentally, what it comes down to is a missionary is someone who is commissioned or is a sent one, a lowercase a apostle, not one of the 12 capital A apostles of the Lord Jesus Christ, but is sent out lowercase a apostle as an ambassador, as a representative, as a commissioned ministry laborer from a biblical local church. You see that in Acts 13. Paul was already an apostle sent by the Lord Jesus Christ. He didn't necessarily need any other body to ordain him or to send him, but the Holy Spirit did it that way anyway. And not only with Paul, but also with Barnabas. They pray, they fast, they lay hands on them, and then they send them out. And then in Acts 14, they return and they report. So key to that definition is that they're commissioned and sent out and recognized with an objective calling by the leaders of a local church. And what is it that they're sent to do? Again, I think this is what you see modeled in Acts 13 through 14. The core of the missionary task is evangelistic activity, making of disciples and forming them into local churches. And is every missionary a church planter? No. But in another sense, yes, right? Because if we're making disciples, is there any such thing as a disciple who's not connected to a local church? The New Testament knows nothing of that. And where no local church exists, the believers there must, let's say it's a biblical imperative, must gather together in covenant with one another to form a local, visible expression of the invisible church. And so that missionary task, the core of it, is the evangelistic activity, making of disciples, planting, strengthening, maturing of churches, ultimately with an eye towards developing local leaders in that church and withdrawing into a partnership relation with them, whereby they can now be the catalyst for further evangelism into their region among their people groups. And that I feel as though that's something that maybe we take for granted in our small corner of the missions community sometimes. In the broader evangelical world, that's not what's understood. A missionary is anyone who goes on a trip for a week or two to paint a wall or to build a roof or to dig a well. And I think as our friends Matthew Ellison and Denny Spitters have wisely written and spoken about, when everything is missions, nothing is.
And that's exactly right. I think, we were getting ready to launch an internship, kind of an intensive internship program through our ministry here to try to recruit more people for this part of the world. And well, two things on that. One, I've come to learn the longer I'm here that I do believe anybody could be a missionary, but not just anybody should be. You need to know you're called, especially to a place like this. But I do know there definitely needs to be more practical training and preparation for going to mission fields, especially fields that are much more unreached and underdeveloped than maybe we have. And so that being said, we were trying to implement an internship program, and some of the leadership in our mission, they were concerned, and rightly so, that this wouldn't just become a short-term mission opportunity for somebody who wanted to get experience before they go into the pastorate. And I thought about that, and my response was, we're trying to train guys so that they'll be better prepared when they come full time. So they're not coming their full term unprepared, but they know what they're getting into. And so I think it would help to weed out some of the turnover rate of those who do come here, especially in this context. But that being said, I think I after he mentioned that, I was going back and looking at some of the history of how short-term missions began to play a role in the American evangelical mission world. And it was like in the 70s and in different college university movements where they would go out and there was a heart to reach the world, but it became, because of the convenience of travel and you can get back and forth, it kind of became a thing where One person was telling me a lot of missions got to a point where, fiscally speaking, financially speaking, they were just as dependent on short-term missions as they
Hmm.
were on sending full time, and that's problematic. And so, what would you say? What needs to be done? How do you address, and how would you speak to a pastor who says, "Hey," or a youth pastor who says, "I want to take my kids on a mission trip." Is it beneficial? Should a missionary receive mission trips? A youth group coming to paint a building. I've read several books. I have my opinion on it, but what advice do you give to a pastor or a youth pastor who says, "Hey, what are the benefits of taking a mission trip, and how can we do it without perpetuating this short-term concept that really I
Hmm.
think is more damaging long-term to the work of mission
Hmm.
and what missionary is?" What would be your response, kind of
Yeah.
advice you get?
Yeah, if the question is, the missionaries ask, should I receive, or the pastor, should we send this short-term trip or team? I want to say yes with an asterisk. And the yes there is, there's much that I think we can point to and say there is a way to do short-term missions in a healthy way, but there's more that needs to be said. There's a study done a number of years ago. It was about a 10-year study by Jay Matenga, and I think Gould was the co-author's name. Escapes me right now, but it was published under the name Mobilization in Motion. I think it was William Carey Publishing that put that out. But the premise was they did a long-term, decade-long qualitative study of mission workers, both American sent, Western sent, but then also indigenous workers, cross-cultural workers sent out from other sending hubs in Brazil and South Korea and whatnot, serving across every continent. And it was fully ecumenical. So broad swath of Christian missionary experience. And the interviews were exploring what each of those long-term workers identified as factors in their mobilization journey, but then what was the decisive factor? And a lot of us assume that a decisive factor is a short-term trip. And a lot of them, I think something like 98 or 99% of them had served in a short-term capacity before committing long-term. So you think, well, there's a correlation there for sure, but is there a causation? And what they found was far and away the two decisive factors that, okay, if it weren't for this, I wouldn't be serving here today. One of them was not short-term missions trips. The two decisive factors were, and we can't control this, but an internal or even a mystical calling experience. Again, this is a broad study, but that was how they described it. Some sort of internal recognition of a personal calling. That was the number one. And then the number two was uh, belonging to a local church where missions was consistently preached and emphasized in the culture of the church, but specifically from the pulpit. And so I think there's other things. If our goal is to mobilize long term, I think there's other things that we can do, even in how we handle the word, and recognizing, like we said earlier, the whole Christian life is meant to be lived out with an eye towards striving together to advance the faith. Philippians 1:27. I think there is a way to do short-term missions well and in a healthy way with that in mind. I think it's valid not only to think about the long-term missionary task, but again, what does it mean for local churches to send out emissaries with a specific task? Look at Philippians, that's what Epaphroditus was. Epaphroditus, you could say, was something of a short-term missionary. He was sent to encourage the apostle Paul. He was sent to deliver a donation to him. He fell ill in the process. The church was concerned for him. And so we know the history of that from reading Philippians. There's other examples in scripture as well. So it's not that we should preclude the idea that a church would ever directly commission workers to go out to perform a very short task. What I think we need to push back on is the commoditization of short-term missions, the idea of a short-term missions industry, which often we've seen amounts to poverty tourism at best, or at worst, it's creating some really toxic cycles of dependency, and codependency with nationals and local communities. I visited Tijuana a couple of years ago, and that is to my understanding, the world capital for all short-term missions trips. You've got all of these Christians, especially in Southern California, that for them it's just a hop, skip, and a drive to get down there. And so you have more short-term trips happening there. And my understanding is all the locals know when that's happening. And their children are often instructed by their parents. They know that if they go at this time of day to this ministry, they can get this food, and then go over here, they can get this food with this camp, they can go to this VBS. And it does create this toxic downward spiral of dependency when done poorly, when done as a commodity or as an industry, or worse yet, when people are going short term just to find themselves or to have an experience. We would say, hey, that'll happen along the way. We want that to happen for your sanctification. We want the Lord to disciple you through that. But there's a lot cheaper ways to get sanctified. Join a local church, sit under solid preaching, get married and have your spouse rub off the sharp edges from your personality. There's cheaper paths to sanctification than sinking thousands of dollars into a short-term trip where maybe that long-term missionary that's hosting you, maybe that individual is under-supported. So let's do it well, which looks like the local church identifying a task to be done and then sending people to do it. That might take a short period of time or a long period of time. But let's not fool ourselves into thinking that creating an industry out of it, as we have as the American church, and saying that everyone should go on a trip. Well, no, not everyone should necessarily go on a trip. I think we have to push back on those things too.
Yeah, I think there's a concept, and this leads in. I know one of the topics that was on the docket that we could discuss was kind of masculinity and missions. And I living over here in this context, looking at the American culture and the American church as a whole, I kind of get an outside perspective. I've been here long enough to where I can see significant shifts. I'll give you an example, just talking about short-term trips. The past couple years, whenever we've been contacted either by a pastor or an individual who's interested in coming on a trip, most of them do ask us and preface it by, would we be a help to your long-term ministry more? So the information's getting out there, what you're sharing. And I think pastors and individuals are becoming more aware that short-term, just coming and pumping a bunch of money into an area and painting something and doing this and that doesn't really help much in the long term. But like you said, I agree. If it's strategic, if it's intentional and why we're doing it and where we're implementing these things, it can be beneficial both to the people coming on the trip and to the missionary on the field and even the nationals engaging. But I think that the whole short-term paradigm has maybe influenced this romanticization of missions, which I think makes missions inherently feminine in a way. So I guess I'll put it this way. I've been big into film since I was young. I've made movies since I was a kid, and we do a lot of video production here. So I love making film, writing script, doing all that. We have a large media outreach and in multiple languages, things like that. And so I think in terms of genre of film. So I'm going to throw this out to you. I didn't give it to you in the preliminary questions. If you had to put missions into a genre of film, would it be a romance, action, adventure, or comedy? You had to choose one of the three.
That's great. Modern missions, unfortunately, puts itself in the romantic category far too often. And I think that's what you're getting at. I think for you on the field, you probably have some days that are more comedic than others, some days that are more romantic than others.
I would
some
say
tragedy days.
Yeah. The reason I put comedy in there is going back to like the original category. Comedy includes all of it. You have romance and comedy, you have the action, you have tragedy, and you have the humor. And I think that all of that is involved. But for some reason, the romance of it, and I remember when I was, thinking about missions, the first book I read after I knew God wanted me to be a missionary was about Jim Elliot. And then I took pilot's lessons because I thought I'll be a jungle pilot. And there was a romance to it that I think when you're young, it helps you stay motivated maybe because you do
Yeah.
have your head in the clouds and you're thinking, oh man, I'm ready to go and give my life for the Lord. But then you get to the field and you arrive and realize nobody actually wants you here. In fact, the first year I was here, I had a politician who was coming to approve our some of the work we were doing. He's a Muslim gentleman. He said, we only allow you here because we don't convert. You're not going to convert any of us. So they don't want you here. So
Mm,
how do you think, let's talk about that a little bit. I'm seeing a shift in the American culture where young men are trying to look for and I think they're going to the wrong places online to try to reconnect with a masculinity that
yeah.
the US culture is really abandoned. And there's a shift to maybe a radical extreme of a masculinity that I don't like the word toxic, but
Yeah.
it's a non-biblical masculinity.
Yeah.
And how would you define missions and masculinity, and why do we need men in missions?
There's a lot of cultural trends at play here, which is what makes it such a good question. And missions is kind of a vignette to see those trends colliding. The feminized, romantic sort of travel agency aesthetic of missions, I think, lies downstream from the effeminization of the typical evangelical church, which we know statistically is going to skew female, but we also know that there are a lot of weak, passive pastors not preaching the whole counsel of God's word, and a lot of softness, a lot of emphasis on sensitivity to the point where you have churches that are themselves dominated by that mentality and effeminized sending in an effeminate way. And what I have seen, though, is a resurgence of that classic, more masculine, but it's not exclusively masculine. I think we can look back in history and look at Amy Carmichael and Mary Slessor and see there's also a ruggedness that previous generations, even of female missionary heroes, that they had that we often lack today. But I do see a resurgence of that classic missionary spirit, which there is a component in that does speak to men. It's kind of the Shackleton effect. It's, putting that newspaper listing out, certain death, right? Odds of success, are nearly none. And you're turning away applicants. You have so many because we're so, I think, tired of being marketed to. We're refreshed, especially the American male is refreshed when he hears of something that demands something of him, that requires something of him. And maybe that is a little bit romantic, but I think you're right. That plays a role in someone's mobilization process, right? They need to be able to see themselves doing a work and loving it. But I see that from groups like Radius. I see that from Missionary Conference. I see that from groups like ours and ABWE and the work that you're doing too. I see more of this emphasis on we need to recover the spirit, the language, the zeal of the Hudson Taylors, the Adoniram Judsons, the William Careys, the Amy Carmichaels as well, where they knew that they were potentially signing up to, in the words of Count von Zinzendorf, to preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten. They knew that it wasn't going to be sexy. It wasn't going to be glamorous from an earthly perspective. And I think that men are drawn to that. I think that should be instructive for us. There's a reason for it. It's not just a sociological or psychological effect. It's because it's biblical. That is what we're called to do. Not every single individual is going to do that, but a healthy church that's preaching the whole counsel of God's word, including texts like Romans 15, where we see that was Paul's driving ambition. We're preaching all of what Scripture says. We're going to see that occasionally men are raised up, and women, but especially men who can pastor and church plant with that God-sized vision to potentially suffer, and certainly suffer, but to endure with the long horizon of obedience to extend the gospel further.
That's right. That's good. I love it. It's definitely something that needs to be emphasized. I've seen, just looking online, we do a lot of online production of film and interaction with people. And I have seen a shift where it can become negative. But one of the things I've noticed here I'm not going to name missions, but there are some missions that maybe are a little more soft in their approach, maybe a little more effeminate, not in a negative way. It's just that that approach doesn't work in an Islamic context. Men are men here, and it's an interesting dynamic I've noticed where you have to be a man's man, and yet the definition of masculinity for Islam is radically different than masculinity as defined by Christ.
Sure.
And so you have to find that balance. And they need biblical masculinity portrayed, because they're coming from, a lot of these Muslim background believers are coming out of an absolute corruption of masculinity. Our pastor, who is a Muslim background believer, he shares with me all the time. We talk about Islam and some of the implications, and he said, Islam is a religion created for man and man's desires. It's their prophet.
It's tribal.
Their prophet got whatever he wanted, and you get your desires. Even heaven is the fulfillment of sensual desires for eternity.
Right.
And so there's this concept of masculinity that both it can hurt the church, because when they come into the church, they feel like, well, I need to be separate from the women and this and that. And it's an interesting balance to try to strike. But what is needed here is exactly that: men who know they're called, men who know they're men, that can lead their families and homes and come into a context like this and display a biblical masculinity that is not, and again, I don't like the word, not toxic. It's not a corruption of what God intended, but it is a display of what God designed. And so I'm excited to see that there are a lot of young men that are surrendering to the mission field that really have that desire. And another thing I've seen is more of a desire for the younger generation wanting to collaborate. And so maybe talk a little bit about that. What should a mentality of a young missionary coming into the field be? One, to a sending church. How can a sending church be effective? And what is that role? Because I think about my context, we're in a place where right now there's no other missionary that is Western, no other white missionary in our town, except for one other guy who's a great guy. He's been here 20 years. He just moved to this town. He speaks Arabic, Wolof, Fulani. He's memorized the Quran. He's translated the Hadiths and Tafsirs into languages. They're seeing a lot of people saved, and we've been working with him to reach the Fulani. But that being said, that it's just us and him that are in this city. Everybody else is. It's not an easy place to stay as a missionary. And so coming into a place like this, once I was on the ground, I thought, well, like, I'm sent by a church. They support us. They have our back. But nobody's here to hold my hand step by step. And so what are some ways both a local church who sent a missionary can be a good sending church? And what are some ways the missionary can, maybe he's in a context where he's working alone, how does he keep himself encouraged as he's trying to implement, what he's come to do?
Well, I think expectations are everything. So to tie in the masculinity piece as well, too, even the way that we articulate our ministry has changed from previous generations. We've done some work lately uncovering archive documents, things written by some of ABWE's early founders and earlier presidents. ABWE's existed since 1927, so there's a rich history there, even pre-Second World War, which is interesting to see. There is language of the apostolic message and the apostolic method. I mean, it'll put hair on your chest reading it. Contrasted with the way that a lot of evangelicals are maybe not outright catechized to talk about their ministry or their call, but at least conditioned to not talk about preaching or proclaiming, but to talk about we're all on a journey and let me share Jesus with you. Let me share my story with you. And those, even simple turns of phrase like that, they gut the evangelistic task of its power and of its gravitas. And that's not to say that evangelism can only happen from a soapbox or a pulpit, that it can also happen over coffee. But it is a proclaiming, it is a heralding of news. And so, number one, for a missionary entering the field, mentality piece is come in with that mentality. It's going to be easier to take that mentality of strength and perseverance and drive and direct it and channel it different ways than it is to take a mentality of sloth and indifference and passivity and try and fan that into flame. It simply won't work. For the church, for the sender side, I think, and there's probably a lot more that can and has been said, but even asking the question, my experience with churches has been the churches that are asking questions like, how do we hold the rope well? How do we communicate better with our missionaries? 9 times out of 10, those are the churches that are already really doing it pretty well and they're seeking to improve it. It's the churches that aren't even asking that yet, that aren't in meaningful fellowship with their missionaries. A missionary is not going to function exactly the way another member of your church is going to function. Of course, there's going to be a degree of separation. But are they frequently put before your congregation for prayer? And not just when they're on furlough. It's simple things. Do you know their names? Are they on your prayer list or your elder team's prayer list? Do you have a care team or a missions committee that so that the pastor himself or the pastoral team doesn't exclusively have to share that burden? Are there individuals who are appointed to provide the continued care, to make sure they read every prayer letter and don't miss a beat and can be constant in prayer, and they can be the ones that, hey, so and so, how's this couple doing in Asia? Well, I can tell you how. We have people like that at our church that are a blessing to me personally, leading our missions committee, because in the same way that these missionaries have been sent out as emissaries of local churches, these individuals are like the ambassador of that missionary back to the church. They're in close connection. Are you leveraging technology? You don't have to wait until furlough to feature a missionary. Ask for a 2-minute iPhone video that you can tie into your announcements pre-service. There's a lot that can be done. And from experience, it does just start with asking that question of how we can be better rope holders. There's lots of tips and tricks along the way, but asking that question regularly is the first step.
That's excellent. Well, there's so much more I want to get into. We are nearing about an hour of discussion, and I definitely want to, in the near future, schedule another interview with you. There's other topics I wanted to discuss. I'm going to get a copy of your book, go through it, and then maybe have you back on and talk about more of these topics. I really enjoyed this discussion. I think that the role that you have is so important, because a missionary on the field can sometimes, depending on the context, even with all the technology we have, and our churches do a tremendous job keeping in touch with us, keeping updated. I'm always encouraged every time I come back from the field, when I go to a church that supports us, people ask me, hey, what about, how's that going? The new building you just put up, or maybe it was, how is this person who was baptized doing, who was just baptized like the week before I came home, which means they're keeping up to date. And I appreciate that about technology, and people are staying up to date. That's definitely encouraging. But I think it's encouraging the ministry that you have. I remember reading, I think it was about Adonai Judson and Luther Rice and some of those men, when they went to the field. Was it Luther Rice, I think, came back, or Martin, one of them, came back and actually full-time just did tours of churches, raising awareness, raising funds, while the rest of the team went to the field. And I think it's so important that what you're doing is very important ministry. I'm encouraged just from this conversation. And I want to encourage people to check out your podcast and look up your information. Go ahead and give us one last time. What's the best way to reach out, get in touch with you?
Absolutely. I'm on Twitter, X, whatever we call it now, at AJKOCMAN. Our show is Missions Podcast. You can find it where good podcasts are found, or go to missionspodcast.com. Probably be the next best step. ABWE has abwe.org. And if you want to learn more about us, you can do that. And then if you head on over to my social media as well, there's links there for the books that have been mentioned from founders, as well as other writings. that we have. I think one of the best things that you could do, though, is subscribe to the Missions Podcast. If you're enjoying the missionary perspective, a lot of the same, I think, complementary perspectives as well from us. And I'm grateful for others in the mission world that are putting out solid content.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your time and this conversation. I know it's going to be a blessing to our listeners, and I look forward to scheduling a future interview as we discuss more of these important topics related to missions in the local church. Well, this is Josh Mead from over here in Senegal, West Africa. We want to thank you for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, share this with somebody you think it'll be a blessing to, whether it's your pastor, a missions committee, or maybe a student who's going into the ministry considering missions. Be sure to share, leave a comment, let us know how this particular episode has encouraged you. Have a great day. God bless.